So to get us started with, and Jeffrey, where are you? Are you mic'd and ready? Because we can, you are? So our first person who is going to get us started, and you're going to be able to do all the Q&A of these folks, but I want you just to hear from them first. And I think Jeffrey is an amazing place to start because Jeffrey will remind us that as much as we talk about people of color, black people, black and brown people, Jeffrey, I like calling him a cultural anthropologist. He told me he's not, and stop saying that. But Jeffrey is a writer, multimedia artist, an indigenous language activist, and most importantly, Jeffrey gives us a beloved conversation to remind us that there are people, Native and Indigenous people, who've had very similar experiences to all of us, and even then some. And when we talk about people and people of origin, this is the origin story. So a part of your inclusive thinking is going to be remembering Indigenous people as well. So Dr. Jeffery.
Sla antola anghike Jeffrey takapo ishak yokitiki wishwatikiti yan goshkin kata antola yiltol. I'm Jeffrey Darensbourg. I'm a member of the Atakapo Ishak Nation of Indians. I'm a mixed person. I live in Bulbancha, which is the only name I use to refer to the place where I live. You can't go into someone's house and just tell them they have a different name. So I never use the word New Orleans unless I'm quoting someone. New Orleans is only 300 years old. It's currently in its 305th year of occupation, of a violent, illegal occupation. 300 years in the timeline of Native people like me is nothing in terms of our length of time being in this land. My own tribe walked up here probably from South America or Central Mexico around 3,000 years ago. So 300 years, we'll wait for it to pass. I still use the word Bulbancha though. And I'd like to talk to you today about some Indigenous allyship, which is a topic that keeps coming up over and over again. Oh, thank you so much. Let's see if it just, wonderful, thank you. Or as we say in Issaquah, or as you might say in Choctaw here in Mississippi, Yaquake. Indigenous allyship is an important topic that keeps coming up in corporate phenomena, keeps coming up on campus. Indigenous people have been in the news a lot more lately, and I think one of the things is we won social media. We just figured that out, A lot of times people didn't want to think about Native people. Even 10 years ago, not nearly as much interest in Native people as there is now. And I think it's a good thing, it's a good opportunity, but I also would like to guide you through this. For one, almost everything the average American knows about Indigenous populations is wrong. And so, I don't know if you can get a full semester credit for this for the college kids. I'm going to give you about a 2-minute introduction to Indigenous people, all right? Indigenous America, an introduction. First, there were people living here before the first Europeans came here. Let me repeat that. There were people living here before the first Europeans came here. If you look over here, this is basically Mississippi. Most of those people were members of a tribe called the Choctaw. Almost like a large percentage of Mississippi place names are Choctaw. If you see a place name in Mississippi like Yazoo or Chula or something like that, those are Choctaw names. There are also some people called the Biloxi, a few people called the Natchez who lived up in that corner up there, but there were people living there. This is a pretty good map of what this area of the world was like in about 1750. If you notice way over here, there's a group of people labeled Atakapo, which is someone else's name for my people. We were way over there, and we're about right there right now. If you want to learn about my people under our actual name, you can look up one of the many articles I've written, but this one is pretty easily accessible. I'm an activist for Indigenous languages and for the use of Indigenous names. I already mentioned Bulbancha to you because the slide wasn't up yet. So if you want to look up stuff about Bulbancha, there's the name right there. Now, as part of my introduction to Native people, I want you to know this. There are still Native people. In the average American's mind, Native people are in the past. We've all seen in our history books images like this. This is a 1735 image of New Orleans. There's a member of my tribe there on the right. All right? We've seen images like this. We may have seen images like this. This is a 1905 picture of some members of my tribe. I'm in this photo. Those are my great-great-grandparents, and that's my great-grandfather. That's why I say I'm in the photo a little bit. I'm in this photo. 1/8 of me is in this photo. I knew one of these little girls, by the way, growing up, and she both chewed tobacco and smoked cigars. I'm not making that up. We might know that there are Native people, like we've seen old photos of it. That's my grandfather and his mother. I always like to show some contemporary photos of Natives just to know, I'm not the only one. There were other people. I'll just leave it there for a second. So Native people are real and are still here now. Native people did not go away. Some of us are mixed now. That doesn't mean we're not Native. We're still descended from the original peoples who were here in 1491, all right? Oftentimes, Native people are left out of the struggle for civil rights or the history of civil rights. I just talked with our filmmaker about this. I mean, everyone knows about Jackie Robinson in Major League. They often don't know about the many Indigenous people who played Major League Baseball before him. Everyone knows about Kamala Harris. And I remember when Kamala Harris was elected vice president, people said, oh, the first person of color to be vice president. And every Native PhD in the United States raised their hand at that point collectively and said, no, she was not. Do you know the name of the first person of color to be vice president? His name was Charles Curtis. He was Herbert Hoover's vice president, a member of the Kaw Nation of Kansas who grew up on a reservation and was elected vice president of the US in the 1930s, a Republican. Charles Curtis, the Republican Party beat the Democrats to that by almost a century. And yes, he was vice president. Look him up. I know everyone's going to hit that Wikipedia page as soon as after this. Often, Indigenous people also and African Americans are intermarried and are kind of the same people often in the South, especially in the Gulf South. Many Indigenous people were enslaved here. Many Natchez people from here who weren't removed to Oklahoma were enslaved in the Caribbean. Many Choctaw people were enslaved. Many African and Indigenous people were enslaved together and ended up forming large mixed populations. There's some popular books about that. Such the fact that there can be people enrolled in Indigenous tribes, but because they have some African ancestry, my state would list them as Negro on records. This is a birth certificate of a citizen of a tribal nation in Louisiana, and you can look here. Both of his parents are listed as Negro. What would you think that person might look like? Who knows? But you're looking at him. That's my birth certificate. Many famous African American people are often also of Indigenous ancestry, and they were all about it. Jimi Hendrix was both African American and Cherokee. His sister is interviewed about this in a great film called Rumble. His sister really looks Native. She doesn't look very African American at all. Mildred Loving, from the famous case Loving v. Virginia, always identified as both African and Native American. She wouldn't let people call her just African American. She's like, I'm both, and you're going to call me both. Crispus Attucks, everyone knows him, first casualty of the American Revolutionary War. One Native parent, one African parent. One contemporary account of the killing said an Indian was killed at the event. But in the United States, African ancestry is seen as a contaminant, and Indigenous ancestry is seen as something not quite real. All right? And neither of those two things are true. Black blood is great, because black is beautiful. That's why I'm so good looking, because I'm like a quarter African. My father was a very attractive, light-skinned black dude. So there's a common cause for struggle, not something to be opposed to. Your liberation is tied up with everyone else's liberation. And when oppressed groups get together, that is something that is really exceedingly powerful. And that is a big message, especially the later activism of Martin Luther King, of trying to unite different groups of people together and realize that they are all oppressed. The other thing I want you to know about Native people in our short introduction, and this will be the end, and you can get your college credit for that, is that Native people did not live in nature. We were actually pretty sophisticated. We had the most advanced agricultural engineering in the world, the most advanced forestry engineering in the world, and the most advanced land and animal management in the world at the time of conquest, which is a reason why there's so many indigenous foods you eat now. If you eat red beans, if you eat hot peppers, if you eat bell peppers, cornbread, chocolate, or any of those things, those are all indigenous plants. And there's a reason why those things were just very well done by the time colonists got here through many centuries of engineering. Also, bison used to live here, I always point that out. Okay, that's the end of the course. Now, people often ask me about land acknowledgements because when you go places nowadays, eventually you're gonna find someone giving a land acknowledgement. You're gonna find someone who at the beginning of a program, often in a very perfunctory way, in a way that, you know, they might just be saying the words and talking through it, acknowledges that indigenous people lived somewhere before. That's true everywhere you are in the Americas. Indigenous people live there. Indigenous people lived here in Jackson. This is an example written with a client. The city of New Orleans occupies an indigenous space known as Bilbancha, a Choctaw word meaning the place of other languages. I'm going through it pretty fast. Located at confluence of waterways and travel routes, this has witnessed trade and cultural interaction between various indigenous nations for many centuries. These nations include, trying to save a little time, but list the nations that are there. I also mentioned indigenous peoples were both enslaved and trafficked in New Orleans and discriminated against, and they acknowledge that those people and their struggle and give thanks and strive for a more just world. Things to include if you're going to do this, the original names, the original nations, a bit of the history that recognized what happened where you are. In Jackson, the original people would have been Choctaw. There's no one word for Jackson, but there are a couple places near here. Funagasha Creek, which means tasty squirrel, is a settlement near here. Also, Chisha Foca, which is in one of the state parks near here, which means a village inside of Post Oaks. There were Choctaw people here. Mention also that indigenous people still exist if you're going to talk about indigenous people. And this question came up on National Public Radio the other day, so you've done your land acknowledgement. Now what? Why not offer services of your business to indigenous people? Or if you know an indigenous business, or if you know some indigenous people who might be interested in the thing that you do. Offered opportunities to give back and pay indigenous people. Take a moment to learn about the people of your area. If you are in Atlanta, or you are in Baton Rouge, or you are in Washington, D.C., they're going to be different sets of indigenous people than here in Jackson. But learn about the people. And remember this, I get this line so many times. I was consulting with an organization once, and they'd done all these publications about indigenous people, and they were horribly wrong. And they said, we don't know how we got it wrong. It's like, did you ask any indigenous people to help you? And they said, we couldn't find any. And I said, I'm really sorry that your organization doesn't have internet access. That's really a shame in this day and age that you just can't get it. I should mention this was about 3 years ago. You will find indigenous people if you look for us. Ask a student group, a community center, service organization, maybe there's a local reservation. Trust me, if you want to find indigenous people to help tell our story in an environment, you will find us because so few people ask us, and we are ready to tell you this story, all right? Nothing about us without us, all right? Include us. That's about it. Also, whatever you're doing, I didn't put a slide of this, if you're gonna harm indigenous people in what you do, don't do a land acknowledgement. It's not, you know, if you're a petroleum industry, don't ask for a land acknowledgement. We already know you hate us, don't worry about it. But if you want to include a land acknowledgement within what you're doing, and I do recommend you do, because it's like what we just learned in the AllySHIFT model. Denial is the first stage, all right? You're denying, like, Well, land acknowledgement is kind of starting the ball rolling. It's like, you know what, we acknowledge that there were and are people here, and that all of those people went through some traumatic times. No matter where you are in the United States, that's the case. And as part of the general pathway to justice, we want to recognize that, and we want to not do those same things to those people or anyone else. All right, we have other people coming up, and they are much more interesting than me. So I'm going to delay this asking a question, and I'm just going to instead say thank you. And I look forward to the other talks. Thanks a lot.
My question that I actually want to ask, and then I'll step off. Why has it been so difficult, it seems to me, for there to be a better appreciation, and to me, just Black folks and Native folks getting along?
Well, first, I've wondered this question my whole life because I am of African and Indigenous and French and Spanish ancestry. And I've always kind of wanted all these different parts of me to get along better. There is such a common struggle, especially in Louisiana and across the Gulf South, where there's common histories of displacement, slavery, common histories of discrimination during segregation, so much in common. And yet, as often happens among minority groups, there are those who wish to divide, who wish to pit one group against another group. And that's a definite strategy of oppression, to pit people against each other and not realize they have common struggle. They want you to think you're very different. But I think especially with Indigenous and African American people, there are so many commonalities, not only ancestry, but also common struggle, common situations, especially in the Gulf South. And I would very much like to see more allyship, yeah. So thank you. I don't really know the root of the problem, but I think the root is just a general strategy that people who oppress also like to divide the people they are oppressing and pit them against each other. I will say, I would like questions. Thank you for that question. I hope I answered it. As a preface, though, I'll say, don't be embarrassed. Because a lot of people know, I don't even know how to talk about Indigenous people, but I want to. Well, how do I do it? I don't know. Just ask me a question, all right? I already know you're the good guys, so just ask me a question, okay? Go ahead. Don't be afraid.
I hate to be the one always asking questions, but I am intrigued with this whole program. This is my first time being at AllySHIFT, and I thoroughly appreciate it. Now that you have said that a lot of Indians and Blacks, Negroes were encamped or slaved together, this helps me in my mind to know my great-grandmother was half Black and half Choctaw.
Yeah, that's really common around here.
And I didn't know why or how that happened, but that enlightened me a little bit about how that could be.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff written about this. There's a great book about the Louisiana issue called Louisiana Creole Peoplehood, which is a book that, unfortunately, I wrote 2 chapters of, but it's good in spite of that. Another really good book is called Indivisible, which was produced by the National Museum of the American Indian, and it's all entirely about African American and Native American communities that are mixed together throughout the US, which of course means there's a lot about Louisiana, but also things about the Mashpee Wampanoag, things about various Choctaw groups. So yeah, I recommend that. But it's a good history, and if you start looking up things, when I was growing up, or even as much as 15 to 20 years ago, there was so little written about this. And in the past 15 years, there's been an explosion of writing about it, which is good, because something happens when people start telling their own stories, and other people are no longer categorizing you. And you can say, hey, I am this, why do I not appear like this in the writing you have? And that makes a huge difference. No matter who you are, where you are, you have to tell your own story. Somebody from your community has to tell that story. So thank you for that issue. But yeah, that's really common here at Choctaw Ancestry.
That you're saying that the books that you write,
Not,
when they were...
Not just me, but yeah.
Okay, I'm just saying the Indigenous community writing books. Because when my kids were little, we used to go to the library a whole lot. And there were little books that had Indian, some like those pictures you showed up there. But they were written by maybe to me and non-Indigenous person's name. Could I possibly say that maybe those books were incorrect?
Probably. I mean, when I think in Louisiana, and I've read a lot of the stuff about Native people in Louisiana, the first time, let me just say this, the first white person to visit my tribe was in 1528. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked with us in the Gulf of Mexico. The first person in our tribe to publish a book about the tribe was in 2003. The first Native people to publish any books about their tribes in Louisiana were in the 1980s. That's a long time of our story being told by someone else, and they didn't tell it right. So it's important, no matter who you are, no matter what your situation is, you are a primary source of your experience. And if someone's writing about you and they don't capture that, well, they're wrong, all right? It's not you that's wrong. Having a PhD doesn't make someone magically smart and able to capture experience. I know, because I am a PhD. It doesn't make you magically intelligent. But when you tell your own story, that has a power that it goes beyond any institution because it has the truth of what you actually experienced. And that is a really important thing to remember in any DEI work, is that we cannot know the experiences of all people. Each of us has different categories we fit in, our family life, sexual orientation, our different abilities, our education, our ethnicity. But at some point, it doesn't matter who we are, we interact with people and we don't understand their experience. And so for a long time, Native people, we've been denied the ability and right to tell our own experience. And now it's amazing to me, even like with the history of New Orleans natives, one Native person has written a book about it. Her name is Elizabeth Ellis. She's at Princeton. She's Native. She grew up on a reservation in Oklahoma. It's amazing how just that one book revolutionized the whole study of it. Just one Native person looking at it. And she's only the first one. And so when someone in the community can look at something and really say, like, this is what our actual experience is like, no matter what that community is like, it makes a huge difference in how that community can be seen. And it's what I tend to write things of people, the stuff I wanted to read when I was a youth about my ethnicity is what I write. Because eventually I figured out I couldn't wait for anybody else. And then I started meeting other people in the same situation, and we had a 15-year Facebook chat that has turned into about 4 or 5 books now. I got off of Facebook, but I can still make a book, even though in spite of that. So yeah, good. Any other questions? Don't be afraid. Yes, Wendy Lewis.
And Jeffrey, I want you to, because you and I have talked about the similarity or the origin of food in terms of where we think something came from or who originated what. I think that's fascinating.
All the time in Louisiana, and I grew up speaking French. My family speaks French, like a lot of people. And people would say, this is French food, this is French food. And then I went to France, and no food was like the food I was eating. But then I'd go to New Mexico, where most of the food is indigenous, like, that's very similar to what I ate. And then as I was in Chicago, I was eating at African restaurants, like, this is very similar to what I ate growing up. Well, in fact, food is a way that people often come together here, and food is like an archaeology of people's experiences. And it shows the way people have come together. When I think about, some of the things we traditionally associate with African American cuisine, grits, red beans, cornbread, those are indigenous foods, period. That's where they came from. They're foods from indigenous people. And African Americans having that as such a big part of the culture is often because, living together for a long time. One thing I found in my research in Louisiana is that almost every place where I find the original neighborhood of free African people in Louisiana, and this includes the Treme neighborhood, the famous Treme neighborhood of New Orleans where jazz comes from. Every place I find it, it's at the site of the indigenous village. As soon as black people get free, who are the other free people of color? Yeah, come live with us. Every place. There is a large continuity there, and it's a way of celebrating that people not only ate these foods to survive, but they made luxury food, you know? Like, this is some of the best food you can eat. I know, because I live in New Orleans. I see people come there from all over the world to eat this food that people ate because they were poor. But they made something out of it. And that's true of like every aspect of Indigenous and African American life. Maybe didn't get the best cards dealt to you, but maybe you made blues music out of it. You know, that's something. That shows something that shows like a hope for the future. I don't even, you know, beyond anything else, that the worst possible situations for people created some of the most enduring art forms. And I can only think of blues music, for example, as an act of hope. Yeah. All right. Okay. Does anyone have one more question? Be quick. Don't be afraid. All right. Well, let's all say it together. I'm going to teach you our word for thank you. It's hueo. Hueo. Say it. Hueo. Or if you're from Mississippi, yakoke. Yakoke is the Choctaw word. All right, yakoke chito, which means thank you very much. And I appreciate talking to y'all. And come talk to me. I won't bite you. All right.